Behind every product we buy lies a chain, but some of those links are forged in silence, suffering, and slavery. Today, we're joined by someone who has made it his life mission to break those chains, Tim Nelson, who is the CEO of Hope for Justice and co-founder of the Slave-Free Allianc, a global leader in the fight against modern slavery. I'm also joined by Hamisha Markan from our department, a brilliant mind passionate about ethical trade and human rights, as we unpack the uncomfortable truths buried in our global supply chains. Thank you so much for joining us, Tim and Hamisha.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
So I think just to kick off, it would be great to just get a little bit of background about who you are, how you ended up where you are now. It would be great for our listeners.
So thanks again for being on here. I originally grew up in Northern Ireland, in quite a small kind of small space, but my family was in an interesting role in that my mum was principal private secretary to the head of the Northern Ireland office at the time of the Troubles. So our family had a car bomb planted outside our house growing up. So we became much more aware of politics and much more aware of the world around us. So consequently, I had three siblings who all ended up doing law and all ended up moving to London, all ended up marrying lawyers. And I was the one who was going to go off and change the world. I'd had the privilege, my mum and dad had let me go traveling when I was 15. I went to Malaysia and Australia for a number of months, and then on to, when I was 16, went to Venezuela, Guyana, and Brazil. And I got to see people who were living in very different worlds and different experiences to mine. So I decided that I needed to earn a lot of money and I needed to make a bigger impact in the world. So my vision at that time was that I was going to be a stockbroker and I was going to earn a lot of money and then be able to help the world. So I went to study technology, and when I was finishing my degree, got offered roles in London and New York, and just felt that I should stay in the community that I was in. I was part of a faith-based community that was making an impact in the local community. Went into banking, became a senior manager in a bank looking after a portfolio of businesses. And from there, one of my clients invited me to sit as a director in an offshore trust in America. So effectively, he was raising a couple of $100 million to invest into high-tech stocks. And my background in banking and technology, I would be able to understand what to do next. And I found myself in Los Angeles with a night spare, and a friend of mine who worked for a children's charity out there invited me out for dinner. And he brought with him a chap who would change my life. When I asked this chap what he did for a living, he said that he worked as a slave hunter, and I'd never heard of that mentally ever. And whilst we're out for dinner, he was on the phone to Condoleezza Rice, and he was arguing about the downgrading of India on the human trafficking register. Condoleezza had been working for the Bush administration. This chap had been out in Mumbai the week before, and he showed me images that were taken the week before of Mumbai of girls that had been in cages that were being shipped all over India. And his challenge to me was that this was going on all over the world, and that maybe if I didn't do something about it, there'd still be children who were being held against their will. And maybe I could just do something that would impact the space where I'm at. So came back to the UK, and off the back of it, spoke to everybody I knew, and a really good friend, Chris, who ran a car dealership network in the UK at the time. He had met 4 people in Manchester that were incubating the thought of putting on an event. And he said, well, maybe we could come together around this event. So we got together in the December 2007. We founded the charity in the April, and we held our first event in the November. And we managed to gather 5,884 individuals to come to the event in Birmingham, in the UK, to tell people about the issue. So I've been on this journey ever since. I sat on the founding board and then came on team back in 2013. And took over just over 4 and a bit years ago running the organization. And it's been a roller coaster ride, but it's also been something that's been incredibly rewarding. Since we launched the charity, we've been able to help just over 1.2 million individuals across our program. So I feel really humbled to be leading the organization and to being a part of the founding and impact that we've seen.
That is amazing, Tim. I feel like the interview can be over now. I mean, that is the most amazing story I've ever heard. Hamisha, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about the research that you're doing?
Okay, thank you, Shuke, for letting me be here and, of course, giving me the opportunity to engage with Tim. So my journey actually started about 2 years ago when I actually found out about modern slavery. And ever since I researched the topic, I've been exploring it through academic research. And what struck me the most was the fact that, modern slavery, or rather how modern slavery is hidden and it's like normalized within our supply chains. And I realized that there is a lack of awareness and as well as data with regards to modern slavery and how it affects our local industries, especially considering the fact that this is a real life risk. It's happening in our supply chains. And so I decided to explore it further, and while I am still in the early stages in my journey compared to like you, of course, and others in the field, I do believe that research is a crucial step towards creating this awareness and, of course, like starting off important conversations with regards to modern slavery, and obviously letting people be aware of the fact that there is modern slavery in whatever we consume as well. So that's how I came about knowing about modern slavery.
So, Tim, I think for people that are unfamiliar with this issue, could you maybe just give us some background and also some key stats as to like what is the reality of modern slavery? Because I think when Hamisha first told me about it, I was like, there's no way this is still happening. And then I watched your interview with Sophia Herrera, and it was really, really shocking to me. And I was like, oh, this is what Hamisha was trying to explain to me a year ago. So can you just give us some background with regards to some of the numbers and what we mean exactly when we say modern slavery?
Yeah, so when we talk about slavery, it conjures up images of the transatlantic slave trade and the horrors that happened where individuals were taken against their will and forced to go over to the Americas and work primarily on plantations. And laws were brought in place to try to address that. But what we find really is that slavery didn't stop. It morphed into what has become known as modern day slavery. And that terminology was fully enacted back in 2000 at the adaptation of the Palermo Protocol. Palermo's in Italy, and a group of leaders met together to really define what that would be and the articulation of that. And it's broken into 5 core areas. That's where we see things like sexual exploitation, those individuals, primarily girls, that are taken and forced against their will to earn money by being sold in brothels. Secondly, where we see labor exploitation. This is where individuals are forced to work in all manner of settings, whether that be agricultural, whether it be in manufacturing. Across the board, we see that as being one of the biggest sectors. The third area is domestic servitude. That's where individuals are held in their homes and forced against their will to do domestic chores. Sometimes it can be the culmination of both sexual exploitation and labor trafficking. And although it does sound probably the lightest version, if I was to say that one of the longest serving victims that we've ever rescued was held as a domestic slave in Los Angeles for 39 years. And you see the extent of the abuse over decades. The fourth area is where we see organ harvesting, and that's where individuals are moved for the organs that they hold, primarily for the benefit of someone who has an issue with an organ in their bodies. We see across the world that organ harvesting doesn't happen in a space where there is an organ donation scheme, so we would be fully advocate for that in countries. And then finally, forced marriage, where we see in particular community groups and cultural issues where children are taken and forced to marry others, many times with the consent of parents, but what we would see is classed as modern day slavery. So those are the 5 big ones. The sum total of all of them would denote to 49.6 million individuals. To put that in context, the entire transatlantic slave trade was somewhere between 16 to 18 million at total. So we're saying a scale that people have never seen before. More people now than at any point in time in human history held enslaved. Of the 49.6 million, it's estimated 27.6 million are within the kind of the labor trafficking aspect of it. So it's seen as a large portion of it, and those individuals are primarily trafficked for goods and services that end up within the supply chains of businesses that we buy products from. And that's where it's not too far from anyone's door, the extent of the huge numbers, but actually the application of it is felt by each one of us in the products that we buy that are made off the back of slave labor.
Hamisha, do you want to
Yes,
comment on that?
so just to add on, so it's important to know that a country can contribute to modern slavery in two ways. So first through the purchase of products, and in 2023, according to the War-Free Foundation, South Africa purchased products amounting to around 40.8 billion US dollars that was linked to modern slavery. And the most prominent products were your electronics, garments, textile, palm oil, and even solar panels. So that's the first way. And then, of course, the second way that a country can contribute is through the exploitation of people within its borders. And again, according to the War-Free Foundation, in 2023, there was an estimation of around 155,000 people in South Africa that is in modern slavery. And this is, of course, deeply embedded in sectors that are heavily reliant on manual labor. And these include your construction, agriculture, mining, amongst others. And what's important to note is that South African supply chains are very much reliant on temporary, subcontracted, and migrant labors. So it obviously increases the risk of exploitation, and at the same time, exploitation increases, especially in areas where there is lack of regulation and also poor oversight.
Tim, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add with regards to globally how this transpires. Like, how does the supply chain try and combat this? Like, what should organizations kind of be thinking about? And I know Hamisha touched on some of the stats in South Africa, but how should we be thinking about it globally, or how should governments be thinking about it to try and kind of curb modern day slavery?
Yes, so there's a number of questions there that you're asking. So I'll try and take them in parts. So the first thing is I really appreciate the stats specifically on South Africa, because that brings it to home. I think the reality is the number of 49.6 million can be so overwhelming that people don't necessarily see until they know what's happening locally. And there's also this expression that it's not just happening in Southeast Asia, which is common misconception, that it's happening in cities, it's happening in agricultural settings in and throughout South Africa. In many ways, as I described how it morphs from what was the transatlantic slave trade to now, it's that you have an individual who is promised something, and promise meets deception, and that ends up to someone being enslaved. So if you understand it in its very core basis, you have someone who's going to do something that then is deceived and then is exploited. Now, many things can be precursors to that. You can have people who have suffering from mental health issues. There could be issues around poverty, people who could be manipulated, coerced. There could be challenges around children being dragged into this or being groomed into this. But effectively, it's this deception that we see for the benefit financially of someone or someone to gain from. When we see companies, quite often companies want to pay a fair wage, but they're most interested in the price that something is being paid, and they're interested in the quality of the product. They're also interested from a supply chain perspective. When is that product going to be delivered? How can I get it directly to consumer? What's the benefit to bringing that into our supply chain? So if it starts, first of all, from a company needing something, and then the second part of that is around how, when someone needs something, that a deception can be placed in space. So an example would be one of the ones that Hinesha has mentioned, that you might want something to go in a product you've got. So all of us have got mobile phones. Those mobile phones that we have a product called tantalum in them. You might not have heard of tantalum before, but effectively that bit that when you plug in your cable every night to charge up your phone, it plugs into tantalum. Tantalum is a derivative of coltan, and it's mined in the DRC and other African countries specifically for the benefit of this. It's also found in capacitors, which are used in every computing device across the world. They're called tantalum capacitors. And it's used if you ever have someone who has a rod or a pin inserted in their arm, if they have an accident or they've been in war or something of that basis, because tantalum doesn't react to heat, it doesn't react to chemicals, and it holds an inert space. So it's perfect for charging cables. But there was a report that was done by the PACE organization in the DRC showing that this You cannot create tantalum now without using 5 and 6-year-old children. In fact, I read a report recently of the Fortune 500 companies in America showing how many children per kilogram of tantalum is being used within their supply chains. So something like that, you've got a company who's just looking to buy tantalum to put into a product that's being manufactured, may not be aware of the nth tier. They may not be aware of where that mining is coming from. So it requires a level of intentionality, and it requires people to want to look within their supply chain. So to get supply chain visibility, you imagine almost like a pyramid where you start at the top as the organization who's buying from the next tier. That next tier is buying from the second tier and the third tier and the fourth tier. And if you've got many companies at the first tier, so a typical supermarket would have between 70 and 100,000 first tier suppliers. If you imagine how many millions of individual businesses that are responsible for that product being produced, it flows directly up the pyramid. So for a company at the top to get complete visibility, you're never going to get perfect, but you may be able to enhance what you do through using some of the new technology systems that are built off the back of AI and that give really detailed analysis based on internet scraping, based on human rights violations, looking at shipping data, to be able to access the right information that can show where your products, goods, and services are coming from. But in this labor exploitation piece, that's definitely where you get a focus to it. You do see it come through in areas like sexual exploitation. I think the stats for South Africa are that 1 in 10 men will use a prostitute at some point in time in their lives, and there are not the women who want to go into prostitution living in South Africa. So it creates a demand that then enables supply to be for individual girls to be groomed, manipulated, coerced into sexual exploitation. So we see it across the board, but it's generally a demand and supply issue. We all want as consumers to pay the lowest price for the best quality goods, and that in itself is leading to a drive that then enables modern day slavery to thrive.
Those are yeah, no, that is quite hectic. And what would you say are some of the big industries that people should be thinking about? I mean, you mentioned the phones. Are there any like key industries that we should also be looking into that are the main? Well, not the main. I guess every industry has is at risk of this.
Yeah, the problem is I know all of the industry. So if you say that if I group it into 4 core areas, or the first area which Hanesh has touched on, agriculture, but agriculture and fishing is the first big one. The second one would be around construction. The third one would be around manufacturing. And manufacturing would cover textiles, garments, electronics. And then the fourth one would be mining and quarrying. In each one of those areas internationally, we see real problems. But it's only whenever you get real world cases coming together. Hinesha mentioned solar panels. Most people don't understand how that happens, but there's an area in China called Xinjiang where there are the Uyghur population live. And currently there are 1.1 million Uyghurs held against their will and forced by the Chinese government to work within the supply chains of major multinational businesses. One of the key products that's mined in China is silicon. When you take silicon after mining and heat it to 1500 degrees, it becomes polysilicate, and it's the most important ingredient or component that's found in solar panels. So the reason why solar panels have become so cheap isn't just because of demand, it's also because that the supply is being manufactured through slave labor. So when those solar panels, which many of them have arrived into South Africa, they've come on the basis to try and help the climate emergency that we see. They've come on the back of individuals being exploited. Another product to give you an example of would be obviously I don't use makeup myself, I've got more of a face for radio, but off the back of it, I know a lot of women like to use shimmer effect makeup. But shimmer effect makeup comes from a product called mica, and it's also the same product that's used for pearlescent effects for vehicles, and it's used for electrical cabling insulation for large buildings. It's a fire retardant material, but it's mined in Madagascar and 2 regions of India, primarily by 5 and 6-year-old children. So when they tell you that you're worth it and that cosmetic product is going to be really enhanced, or when they try to subsell you the pearlescent effect of how great your vehicle is going to be, they don't tell you that it's made off the back of exploited labor. And the problem that we see is across every industry, there is some form of modern day slavery happening. And it's not a question for businesses of if you've got it, because we're seeing 70 to 80% of all businesses globally have some form of issue. It's whether you're prepared to look, and then what will you do when you find it?
Hamisha, do you have anything to share around this?
No, so I just feel that, like you have said, we are living in a globalized economy, and our supply chains have obviously become so much more complex with many tiers of suppliers. And I think that the problem comes in when you go beyond your tier one suppliers. So when you start looking at tier two, tier three, it becomes much more complex, especially like in managing the processes and practices. And of course, like the visibility at those levels are quite limited. So as such, we have obviously these exploitations taking place because it's difficult to actually detect them. And of course, then that is linked to all the products that we are using today. So it's quite a scary world out there. But I really do believe that we have to start raising awareness with regards to that, especially from a South African perspective.
Yeah. And how do you believe, Hamisha, we can raise some of this awareness?
So firstly, I think research plays an integral role. I mean, if you have to look at the research out there, a lot of research is dominated by the global north, such as UK, the US, and I also believe that it could also be as a result of legislations that have been passed. Like for instance, in the UK, you have the Modern Slavery Act of 2014, and then in the US, it's the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act. So that could have driven this increase in research. But from a South African perspective, there is limited research. And I do feel that once we start writing more papers, creating that awareness, people will start thinking about modern slavery. They'll start thinking about the products they are using, And of course, they would also then start demanding for organizations to have ethical processes in place, to show that visibility as to where a product came from.
I agree with you, Hamisha. And then, Tim, are there any surprising stats that you've come across that people should be aware of or that could shock us?
I mean, it's quite interesting. I'll just comment on one of the things Hamisha shared just there now, and I want to just show you just a very quick image, just to kind of give you a sense of where we're now starting to see legislation roll across the board, and probably worthwhile commenting for those who are watching, for if you're just at university and you're trying to understand it. We saw legislation start to come through in 2000 when Arnold Schwarzenegger from the movie film Terminator and others was governor of California. He brought through the Transparency in Supply Chain Act back in 2000, and it started to mandate companies that were over 100 million turnover to have some form of statement on their website as to what they were doing. And then we saw the UK brought forward the Modern Slavery Bill with Theresa May before she became Prime Minister, when she was head of the Home Secretary. And that started to ask questions of companies that had annual revenues of 36 million or more. Section 54 of that bill required them to put police and bring forward a modern slavery statement. Then we saw things start to roll very, very quickly. And we saw Norway bring in a Human Rights Act, France bring in an act around supply chains, and Germany transparency in supply chain. Now we saw Australia, and we're starting to see increasing moves now towards proposed legislations across the board. And I was a couple of weeks ago, I was out at the launch of the Modern Slavery Council in Ireland. They're about to bring forward a national referral mechanism, and we've got South Korea now proposing as the first Asian country looking to try and address this. But I think the shocking thing for me would be the lack of legislation that currently exists in Africa to deal with this. You look at that graph and you're starting to ask the question of, why is it just European countries or more of a Western approached countries that are looking to try and address this? This needs to be something that actually Africa could lean on. And certainly in South Africa, because you have a highly skilled workforce, you've got a real ability to move quickly in this space, but it requires legislation that's going to be needed to be put in place and then enforced. So if you start to dig into the figures across the world, the problem that we would see is if you added the sum total of every anti-trafficking organization in the last year, there was a little over 130,000 individuals that were found and brought to a place of freedom. And that 130,000 out of 49.6 million tells me it's a David and Goliath fight. And therefore, we're going to need to have many more people get passionate about this. I describe how we need to have people who are kind of getting off their blessed assurance and starting to reach out and make a bigger difference in this area. We need to shake people from a place of apathy and drive people to a place of action. We need to encourage more people to get passionate about the individuals who are being affected in this way. Quite often we talk about the fact that they are a son or daughter, they are a mother, a father, a cousin, a nephew. They are connected to people. And if they were in your family, you do everything to try and make sure that they were brought to a place of freedom. The fact that they are someone's means that we all need to do something more. So looking at the statistics, seeing where the problems are, whether it's speaking to parliamentarians, people who can get on board from a legislation point of view, speaking to those people from a national perspective to start to call on major changes to be made, because the lie is that we all have no power. The reality is that collectively we can make a bigger difference. And irrespective of the party that's in power in any given country, if they hear a demand that comes from individuals, they will want to bring change. And I really think that there is a need in South Africa for a youth movement to force the awareness and agenda of this, and to tell people that it really matters. And wouldn't it be amazing if South Africa was the first country in Africa to bring legislation in enforcing this? I just think there's something about that first place that makes a big difference. And then other dominoes of other countries could come on board, but it needs one country to step up and propose this type of legislation, and then see an enforcement body to try and address this, so that, could South Africa be the first country in human history to end modern day slavery? It could do, but it would need a lot of people to become very passionate about making a difference.
Yes, yes, and I think it's an awareness as well. So in South Africa, there are laws, not directly based on modern slavery, but I mean, we have like the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, 1996, that touches on slavery. And then we also have the Prevention and Combating of Trafficking in Person Act, 2013. There's a Children's Act, 2005. There's Labor Relation Acts, and then there's also this Employment Equity Act. But the problem is that all of these are implemented, but the problem is the lack of enforcement. So I think like once like government officials start really putting strict guidelines with regards to this and enforcing these laws, there probably will be changes within South Africa, especially in terms of labor exploitation. And then, of course, it's all about the awareness, getting people to realize where their products are coming from, and that there is such a thing as modern slavery. I mean, 2 years ago, I did not know that modern slavery existed. I knew about human trafficking, but not modern slavery. And then it just so happened that I came across the concept of modern slavery, and that's when I started exploring it. And it's a scary world out there. I mean, recently there was an event held by UJ as well, and they showed us this movie called 8 Days, and after watching that, it was like, this world is so dark. It's so scary what is out there and what can happen, It's not just people that you don't know. It could also be people that you know that is that forms part of a syndicate that's involved in human trafficking and, of course, the exploitation of people. So, we just have to become really, really aware of what is happening out there.
I would agree. I would definitely agree. Sorry to intersect, but I would definitely agree. I think there's a definite need for that culmination of the legislation that exists in fragmented parts to be pulled together under modern slavery legislation to bring that big bang that's required. I do think movies drive awareness, which can lead to action. They sometimes sensationalize the issue and bring fear, and that can lead people to a paralysis situation. But from my end, the ability to harness the thought and to see action happen is what has moved human history. You know, that arc of human history moving towards a place of freedom, and that the cry of the human heart to want to see people set free is something that I think innately we all carry, but it's not whether or not we're ever seeing it happen through our lives. And that's the bit I would love to see more people getting passionate about this.
Yeah. So, Tim, I just want you to comment a little bit more as to why you believe there needs to be one law, like the modern slavery law. And maybe if you could just give us a comparison with regards to if there is one in the UK or in the Western countries, and how it's more helpful to have it this way than how it currently sits.
Okay, so if, as it stands at the moment, if you have fragmented laws, it makes it very difficult for there to be a prosecution to take place in that space, because you're assessing one part of what is the issue rather than the culmination of the intentionality of the issue itself. So when the Modern Slavery Bill came through in the UK, in 2015, it was not that there wasn't anything in place before then that could cover parts of it in terms of exploitation or harm, but the issue of pulling it together suddenly focused the mind of the police, the Home Office who look after policing, and then also on the prosecution side of things. So by it coming through, suddenly there's a massive shift towards training and awareness of this issue, to lifting the stone and uncovering what it is. And then whenever it appeared in courts, there was a much greater sense of understanding because it was articulated, you know, from the Palermo Protocol, articulating the act, the means, and the purpose of trafficking, made it very clear for the courts to articulate what was the act, what are the means, and what's the purpose of this? How did it flow together? So for the police do a great job across the world in every country, some to differing degrees, but they're inundated with so many things that they've got to consider at all times. And what we need to have is simplicity. So one of the things that I would love to see, and we're in discussions with the UN on the redefinition of the Palermo Protocol, about whether or not we can gather a way of language that enables more countries to start to come on board and agree what the terminology will be. But if you have one law that exists in every country, then for the likes of companies, it makes it super simple. If you've got fragmented laws that agree different things in different spaces, then companies find it very difficult to effectively deal with that. So in the same way as in South Africa, if there was one law in South Africa that was the same as the UK, that was the same as Australia, suddenly a company then will find it much easier to export and to sell in that country than it would do if it was differing laws in different degrees. But the key thing is prosecutions. If we rescue individuals from trafficking and modern day slavery, and we don't see prosecutions, then those traffickers will just take another individual to fill that void, fill that space that we've got. And we would talk about the fact that if we don't see prosecutions, we're just interrupting a trafficker's day. They will still do the same thing. So by having the right laws, enforcing, like Hinesh has said, like we can bring that enforcement across the board, and then seeing prosecutions that we can amplify. So we hold them up as saying, if you do this in South Africa, you will go to prison. It will be a lengthy space of time, and we will take the money that you've earned off you. Those are loud sounds that then send signals to individuals who are considering exploiting individuals, and seeing it stop.
No, I agree with that point, Amisha.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to know, like, since the implementation of the Modern Slavery Act it's actually 2015, would you say that there has been changes in terms of what corporate companies in the UK are disclosing in terms of modern slavery? And do you feel like they are starting to look at like the different tiers of suppliers within the supply chain?
Yeah, so a few questions there. So the first part is, I would say that companies are addressing this now. The bigger companies have the more that they can do, and the more funds to be able to address the issues within their supply chains. Some companies are better than others, and some companies want to be best in class. So it can be complex because if, say, for instance, you're buying something from a particular supplier, you might want to get extra information from them, but you might only be buying maybe 2% of their business worth. So how can you leverage getting more information and getting understanding and seeing change come through? So quite often it can be through working groups that they can get more information. So in the UK, we would have 23 of the largest utilities companies that we chair, Utilities Against Slavery. It's a working group that happens on a quarterly basis, not as an oligopoly against trade, but effectively as a body that would agree that we're not going to compete on human rights. So when those companies send supply chain questionnaires, normally the suppliers would get sent 23 supply chain questionnaires. If they were all supplying the same company, then they're receiving 23. But because we've got the working group, they send one questionnaire on behalf of all 23. There are 47 questions that are asked, and that enables those companies to love it. You know, if you're only getting one questionnaire, it's so much simpler for you to deal with it. So I would say that, first of all, it has made a big difference. Has it changed the game completely? No. And what we really need to see is enforcement of the modern slavery bill. There still hasn't been one company who has been brought to task in the courts because they haven't completed a modern slavery statement. So if you are 36 million or more annual turnover, you have to have that statement in your financial accounts. That's roughly about 13 to 15,000 businesses in the UK. There's still a proportion of those that are not putting anything in their accounts. So we do need to see prosecutions. More recently, the proposed changes from the European Union on the Corporate Supply Chain Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, they were moving to have complete ownership of your entire tiered supply. So it's engaged many, many more conversations on this issue. That was enacted last year, but in February, the European Union, because of many of the tariff challenges off the back of the new Trump administration, they brought forward Omnibus as a change pattern for Europe, which delayed some of those enforcement of CSDDD and also changed the focus and scope. So it's kind of meant that people are less likely to spend money on full tier visibility, but for those companies that are, it's giving them much greater understanding of the supply chain that they actually have. So we have seen massive changes. Is there more they can do? Yes. The only other thing that I can see that will really drive this that's being discussed at the moment is the potential for CEO criminal liability for companies that are complicit or compliant on this issue. They are acting like serious and organized crime, because the CEOs know what is happening, where the products are coming through, and they could do something differently but are choosing not to. In those spaces, we would like to see CEO criminal liability, because then the game will be completely changed forever.
And how does this still happen if there are like supply chain audits? What is wrong with the current supply chain audits that companies are doing? Why are they not picking this up?
Scale. So if you've got 70,000 first tier suppliers and 1 million to 2 million individual suppliers within your supply chain, how many companies are you going to be able to audit? I mean, I'm speaking to multinational companies that might be auditing maximum 200 companies a year. So in that space, you have to have technology-based solutions that can give you enhancements to know where your areas of help and support are. I head up an organization called Slave-Free Allianc, which is a subsidiary of Hope for Justice that we started back in 2015. And it mandates companies to come on board, and we do gap analysis. And from that gap analysis, we can pinpoint where the red flags are, what are the areas that we need to get on board with. So like in the UK, we would have the top 17 we would have 17 out of the top 100 companies on board so far. But as we start to work through with them, it's complex. And what we need to try and do is put a scheme of work together for them. This isn't going to be turned around overnight. There is no silver bullet. To be able to address this, we're going to need layer upon layer of change and implementation and strategy. And that's why, kind of as an NGO in this space, what companies don't need is someone putting them on the front page of a newspaper to embarrass them. What they need is somebody to sit round the table as a trusted friend and ask the very difficult questions. Be willing to walk with them on the journey of discovery and help them to address and change the real core aspects of this. And we've been able to do that and seen some massive changes in multinational companies as a result.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing point, because I know a lot of organizations obviously try to protect their image. And if they feel like their image is going to be I don't know,
tarnished
because of slavery or of the finding of slavery, then there's a reluctance from organizations to actually speak about modern day slavery, or to actually investigate whether they have it in their supply chain, versus if they have a partner like yourself, who just shows them where the risks are and how they can make the necessary changes to improve.
Yeah, I mean, we had one company in the UK that there was one newspaper article that came out on a Sunday, and by the Tuesday they'd lost £2 billion off their share price because of that one article, and they haven't regained it several years later in terms of where that share price is. So I think the threat that companies are seeing now is that consumers are going to change their buying habits, that it's going to affect the tarnishing the reputation as much as it is the legislation. But I think the consumers are becoming more aware. It's one of these things that the more you're aware of what impact you've got and your culpability in buying products that people are made slaves through, it makes you think differently about what you buy, who you buy from, and the questions that you ask.
Mm-hmm. 100%.
I definitely concur with what you have said. I mean, like today, the focus is on environmental sustainability, and a lot of time we have these empowered consumers that are actually putting pressure on companies to implement sustainable practices. But I think it's time now to also make them aware of the fact that there's also social issues, and we need to start focusing on social sustainability as well.
Yeah, I mean, you take something like tuna fishing. In European Union now, if you want to buy tuna, that to the can level, they can tell you whether or not that fish was caught through a net or caught through a pole fishing, because of the practices of overfishing. But they can't tell you how many people were on the boats. They can't tell you the conditions that they were in, and they can't tell you if there was slave labor. So we're actually caring more about the fish than we are about the people on the boats. And that's the same for climate change. So in the production of solar panels, that's the largest use of coal in China, is in the production of solar panels. So the unintended consequence of wanting to drive more change on solar is going to lead to more coal being used in the production of those solar panels. So I think we're dealing with a very nuanced situation that requires a level of thought and difficult conversations to have, and no exact science in terms of how we deal with this, but to hold those things in tension, that yes, we want to live in a world where climate is taken seriously and carbon is pulled out of the atmosphere, but we're not going to do that at the expense of individuals being exploited.
Yes.
Yeah. And then Tim, can you just comment a bit about the tech? I know you touched on it a little bit. What is some of the tech that you're seeing in your space that you feel like is going to change or is going to improve the current conditions?
I think there's a real sense at the moment of we're in a new day with AI, and up until now, there's been a sense that everyone has wanted to use information. Most that have got on board this have started doing internet scraping and gathering news stories from different locations and trying to bring them into awareness, so that if you've got a company that there's a story that's just been released on, you'd want to know that that story being released. It's complex because you have to have it in every language, and therefore, real-time reporting. Now we're starting to see graph technology being used, AI coming through and augmenting that. But we're also starting to see where there's a nature of people being able to put the bill of materials in from any product or component in, and for that to come through and bring right down to the factory level where products are created and supported. Tracking those goods and services with real-time shipping data. We're seeing individuals who are also seeing purchase orders and how those purchase orders are moving in different spaces. So the adaptation of blockchain and blockchain-based technologies gives us a reporting analysis for people's supply chain. But beyond that, these technology platforms, where there is massive money being invested to try and drive at real-time data to enhance the experience for chief procurement officers, is really helping. There is a long way to go, but if you imagine, this is like the Industrial Revolution, where when they started building factories at the first part of the Industrial Revolution, everything was inefficient, and companies didn't manufacture more by bringing the machines on board than they did whenever they were just being handmade. And it wasn't until probably 20 to 30 years afterwards that they started to get the efficiency gains, because people were starting to ask different questions, starting to do things in a different way. And we've seen that when technology came through with computing, that helped us a bit. We all got on board with Excel and we started to learn how to do spreadsheets and use Microsoft Word and all the rest of it. But now with AI, oh my gosh, with ChatGPT, what you can do and other platforms and all that, it's all enhancing our awareness and understanding of potentially what we can do. But certainly from the technology platform stuff, some of the things I'm seeing, the ways in which people are bringing innovative solutions together is going to revolutionize the level of data and experience that procurement teams have got. But it's also going to bring complexity with it because there's a sense of now you've got more data, what are you going to do with that? And once you know, what are you going to do to try and address it? How far are you prepared to go? What level of funding are you prepared to put in place to rectify situations from there?
That's amazing. No, I think that's amazing. Like, I mean, the fact that we have these technologies coming about and obviously being able to see patterns and whether there's like exploitation happening is, yeah, definitely going to help in combating modern slavery.
Yeah.
We'll just have to see what the future holds.
And then Tim, do you, because I know you guys work globally, do you have any African-led models that can give us some hope with regards to combating this very urgent issue?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing adaptations from different locations across Africa. You know, the one thing for anybody who's watching this from outside of Africa, people throw that term around but don't realize how different the countries are within Africa. And I think it's sometimes is done as a disservice to the countries within Africa itself, because if I was to say, when I've traveled to Tanzania against South Africa, they're very, very different countries. Ethiopia, very different. Uganda, very different. But there's a sense that up until now, Western companies have gone to Africa and exploited Africa for natural resources, cheap labor. And I think there's now a real sense of understanding and need to try and provide visibility. If I was to say what I think is going to happen for Africa in the next 5 to 10 years, there are going to be amazing individuals in countries that are going to come up with solutions to provide that visibility directly for the product itself. So if you've got an artisanal mines system that might be happening in the DRC, I think it'll not be long before you'll be able to tell what mine is that from. An example I would give you on the world stage is, it used to be that you could buy cotton, but you didn't know where it was coming from. Now they can isolate the isotopes on any garment you're wearing that's cotton in it, and they can tell you which field it was grown in across the world. I think you're going to start to be able to see that from a commodity perspective. And in terms of how that will help, I think it will also give a sense of people being able to sell products for a higher level because they've validated that the supply chain doesn't have any form of issues within it around modern day slavery. So we've seen initiatives brought forward in Africa like green copper, which you may or may not have heard of, but green copper itself is providing more visibility within the supply chain itself, and therefore those companies can stand head and shoulders above the others and be able to testify for what they're doing in this space.
Yeah, that's amazing, Tim. Hamisha, what are some of the gaps you've seen in research around modern day slavery that you believe we need to give urgent attention to?
So yes, I think there is quite a bit of gap, but like I said earlier, most of the research is dominated by the global north. And to the best of my knowledge, in South Africa, there is limited research on modern slavery. So that's one. And then also, from doing the research, a lot of the research articles focus on content analysis and our systematic literature reviews. So there is a gap in terms of like quantitative data collection. And this could also be due to the fact that it is what's this very sensitive topic. So not many organizations would want to go out there and obviously disclose the fact that there is modern slavery happening. So those are some of the gaps, and I do believe that yes, we need to start writing a lot more about modern slavery in South Africa so that we can create that awareness.
Yeah. And then I think this is a great opportunity, Tim, for you to just walk us through how your organization supports organizations in assessing and addressing some of the risks within their supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, what we start with is an organization that could be anywhere on their journey of human rights and understanding. Quite often, they're grappling with a number of big risks. Most international companies have what's called a risk register, and they're trying to analyze where the risks are and mitigate those risks. So they use a traffic light system, a red, amber, green system, and they're trying to work out which are our red risks and how do we mitigate those red risks itself. So on this issue, when people start to be faced with CSDDD in Europe carries a 5% global turnover fine attached to it. So not 5% of the trading subsidiary in Europe, but 5% of the global, making it one of the biggest risks financially to any form of business. So in that space, then at a red risk, companies are not going to not want a mitigation strategy. They're going to want to try and deal with it. So part of that will be around the size of the team that they look to implement based on the size of the company and also their exposure to the potential risks across key commodity groups that it would exist across the board. So as we see companies looking to try and address it, then we would generally get calls from those individual companies as seen as pretty one of the preeminent organizations that are dealing with this in business. We would then work with that company to try and understand what they've done before. We conduct what we call gap analysis, which is really to understand what they've done so far, what their business does. We work with key kind of individuals at C-suite level within those businesses to understand the appetite and kind of the kind of issues that they're grappling with and the sources of supply. I speak almost on a daily basis with multinational companies and trying to wrestle with the complexities that exist. And then our team would conduct a report on that basis. From that report, we would sit down with the senior leadership team and we would determine what a 3-year strategy might look like. And we give flexibility within that. So for a company like AstraZeneca, we might have gone internationally and trained all of their staff in all of the jurisdictions that they're in with localized training. We might go to another company and they've said it public. Any of these are public things, so I'm not going past a non-disclosure agreement. But for a company like VF, who own North Face, Vans, Timberland, we'll have gone in and analysed logistics factories. We will be going in and seeing the kind of goods and services that are coming through that space and whether any of the warehousing staff and people like that have been exposed to modern day slavery. But we'll effectively work and put a bespoke plan in place for that company based around their appetite. Some companies just want to be compliant, others want to be best in class, and we effectively help them through that journey across the board. We launched that back in 2018. And as I say, we work with hundreds of multinational companies to try and help them. It's quite humbling, actually, to see the impact that companies can have in this space and that small decisions can lead to a huge implementation of a plan change. And sometimes it leads to products being sourced in other spaces. Sometimes it leads to bigger conversations with the companies that they are buying from. And sometimes it leads to a better appreciation and awareness of the problems and risks that are existing within a core business.
No, that's amazing, Tim. So if there's one thing that you'd like to leave our listeners with, many of them obviously young professional students and procurement leaders, what's the one challenge that you would like to leave them with?
Can I give them two? Just because I think
sure.
two. I think it's easy for me to say this is what we are doing, but the OECD have guidelines that I think are really important for businesses to try and look at and to try and address. And really that would cover a number of things like mapping supply chains, engaging suppliers, monitoring working conditions, providing training for procurement and implementing remediation plans. Those things are going to be taken care of, but understand the principles that exist within OECD. And then the second thing is, there's a lady called Mary Ann McCracken who you will never have heard of, who most people who are listening to this will never have heard of. But this was a lady born at the end of the 1700s in Belfast. And bear in mind, that's before suffrage, so women had no rights at that moment in time at all. And she heard about the transatlantic slave trade, and she abstained from having sugar in her diet and led a movement of women to abstain from having sugar in their diet. So much so that sugar sales in Northern Ireland collapsed. Alongside that, she led a movement with 3 other men that led for Belfast being the first port in the world to stop slave ships from docking. And bearing in mind that the wealthiest person at the height of the transatlantic slave trade who had made money off the transatlantic slave trade, based in New York, was from Northern Ireland because they'd made so much money off the back of it. And the third thing I'd say about Mary Ann McCracken, when Abraham Lincoln passed the Abolition Act, when she was in her 60s, the biography that I read about her talks about her rugby tackling individuals who were going to emigrate from Northern Ireland to America, to ensure that when they got to whatever state they were going, they would ensure that the senator had passed the law that Abraham Lincoln had brought forward and that it had been implemented. There is a spirit that needs to be on everyone that's listening to this, like Mary Ann McCracken, that it doesn't matter if your name's not in lights, if your face isn't on a coin, if you don't have a prominent statue alongside Nelson Mandela or whoever else you hold up in esteem. The reality is you need to come at this with an intentionality that you can do something. And like Mary Ann McCracken, even though you don't feel that you've got any rights, and she had no rights, she couldn't own land, she couldn't own a business, she couldn't do hardly anything at that point in time because none of that had been given to her. She came at it with a spirit of, I need to do something that's going to change people's lives. And she did. And maybe, just maybe, in hundreds of years later, people will be writing about people that are listening to this podcast because of what they've done with their lives to change the reality for individuals who are enslaved. And I'm sure the people who grew, who were involved in the picking of kind of cotton and sugar and other aspects that were affected through the transatlantic slave trade never heard of Mary Ann McCracken. And certainly she isn't like a Wilberforce poster child on slavery. But she is someone that cared, and I've had the privilege in the last 17 years of meeting some phenomenal people who are literally changing the planet. Their names will never be recorded in kind of up in lights, but their names are recorded in history. And I would encourage everyone to be shaken off the spirit of apathy and to treat this. We often get told that what we're trying to do is impossible. And we choose to greet impossible with the words that Muhammad Ali had, where Muhammad Ali used to say that impossible is just a big word thrown around by small-minded men who find it easier to live in a world that they've been given than the power they have to change it. That impossible is nothing, impossible is temporary, impossible is a dare. So today, I dare everyone that's listening not to just sit back and think it's somebody else's issue, but maybe you could be a part of helping change this. And like I was challenged, maybe if you don't do something about it, more people will still be held against their will. And even though they're calling out to a God to try and help find this, God's waiting to see who's going to act and who's going to pick this up and run with it and make a difference in the lives of everyday people all over the planet.
No, that is amazing, Tim. That is really, really amazing. Tim, thank you so much for giving us time. Hamisha, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would tell people they should be curious and start asking questions about how and where the products were made, and I think follow the path of righteousness and choose fairness and dignity, and yes, let's start creating that awareness so that we can help people out there.
Yeah.
Thank
Tim
you.
and Hamisha, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate you joining the podcast and making time, Tim. I know you're a very busy guy. Yeah, we'll chat soon when I share everything with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.